Today's chapter is from EVERNIGHT by Mackenzie. It is chapter 8, Home. There were so many people in the slums of King's Haven, it reminded Lara of the crates of crabs she'd sometimes see down at the docks, all living and crawling and fighting on top of one another. Many got by in the poorhouses, slaving away in return for a bowl of sludge at the end of the day and a bed in a crowded, stinking dorm. Others, the lucky ones, like Joe and Granny, lived in crumbling tenement buildings, entire families crammed in small, disease-ridden rooms. Not Lara. She'd already spent a chunk of her childhood living in other people's pockets, sharing dormitories and classrooms. When she'd run away, she'd promised herself that she'd find something better. And she'd kept that promise, just as sure as she'd kept the promise to be the best tosher in the city, and the promise to never rely on anyone else, because if you didn't give people the chance, then they couldn't let you down. The Aurelian Opera House sat near the centre of the city, away from the slums, on the banks of the great river Anchor. It was a huge old jewellery box of a building, the sort of place only real toffs could afford to visit. The Silver King himself had a private box there, among the red velvet and gold, and the smells of caramel and slick, polished mahogany. Above the grand cavernous opera hall, there was an ancient attic. The attic was filled to bursting with countless trinkets and props and pieces of set gathered from many years' worth of performances and shows. It was so old, in fact, and the opera house had been built upon and extended so much that people had forgotten that this attic existed. And so the jumble of sets there, the gallons and castle walls and painted hillsides, and had gathered dust. It was a rambling, lost museum. Lara had discovered the attic years ago and decided that it would do nicely. Her bed was a sleigh made of wood. She had arranged sheets and blankets in such a way that it was comfortable and warm, and tonight she lay beneath those blankets, holding her wooden locket up to the light of a single dragon breath lamp. Her finger traced the engravings on the polished casting. On one side, a single bird in flight. On the other, a hurried scratching of letters, forming a name. Lara Bell Fox. "That's important, that is," Granny had said. "Listen to it." Listen to it? What does that mean? It's a hanging lump of wood. She turned the locket over in her fingers, every part of it familiar. Flashes of memory came to her. The disinfectant smell of Miss Rackett's home for wretched souls, the cold darkness of the dormitory, and the echoing voices of the older children as they told stories, eerie stories of a night without end, and the ghastly wild monsters who came with it, the EVERNIGHT, and the painted folk. The thoughts made her shiver, and she gripped the locket tightly. In all the world, the wooden locket was the only thread connecting her to the life she'd once lived, a life that had been stolen away on the night she'd been lifted from the wreckage of a terrible disaster on Crippleback Street, a tiny, miraculous survivor. When she'd run away from the orphanage, Lara had tried to find things out, had gone to the neighbourhood where she had once lived, back to Crippleback Street. The people there, at least the ones who were not drunk, were friendly enough and had no trouble recalling the night of the incident. "A great big explosion ripped right through one of the tenements," a toothless old woman had told Lara. "Tore through the brick like it was paper, and no one could figure out what caused it." When Lara had broached the subject of her parents, though, neither the old woman nor anyone else she asked had been able to remember anything at all. It was as if Lara's family had been ghosts. Presently, Lara wedged her fingernails into the tiny gap between the two halves of the locket, and she tried and tried to prise it open. If there were pictures of her parents in there, what if there were? People kept pictures in lockets, didn't they? She wondered if she looked like her mother or her father. Had they both been dark-skinned? Had her mother's hair grown outwards in tight black curls like her own? Sometimes she'd imagined that they were still alive, close her eyes and concentrate and almost feel them hugging her. but coming back from those imaginings was so painful that she had not tried it for a while. The locket would not budge. It never did. Her fingernail bent back, and she swore and tossed the locket across the attic. It pinged and rattled its way to the floor amongst the many scattered things. Panic flooded Lara's insides. She stumbled across the attic and began to toss objects out of the way. Lumps of wood and lengths of rope, crates and boxes, her heart freezing up at the thought that the locket might be gone. But there it was, nestling in a pile of rags. Lara snatched it up and held it to her chest. "I'm sorry," she said. "Never again." Tiredness took her then, and she climbed beneath her blankets and let sleep embrace her, the locket still clutched to her heart.